Okay, recording.
All right, everybody, welcome to the latest meeting of the Kansas Socialist Book Club. Today we are going to be discussing the introduction, prelim, and the first two chapters of Wage, Labor, and Capital. So I guess let's dive right into it. So the introduction starts with a quick bit of historical context. The work was originally, it wasn't like meant to be a written work. It was a series of lectures that Marx gave a bunch of workers around Brussels, actually. And some people were like, wow, he did such a good job of explaining this stuff to the workers around here. We should make a series of newspaper articles about it. Later down the line, somebody collected those newspaper articles, or Engels and Marx collected those articles together and formed them into a more cohesive work like the pamphlet we see today. Um, Engels, the person writing the introduction, lets us know that since he gave those lectures, Marx has developed his theories a little more. And so he's letting us know that, like, hey, this text isn't the original, but we've harmonized it with our current understanding of capitalism and all of these concepts. Tell you that this isn't the original written work, but tell you, like, hey, the changes we made are good.
Yeah, the
And so
adapt.
then,
I was just going to add, sorry. He adapted it towards more of his later works of like Capital and what was the other work that he used
should
in
have been
reference as well?
uh, like the critique of political economy. He
Yes,
wrote
yeah.
these.
So he used
I
those
know
two
it by
works.
from reading Capital. I know it by its German name better than the English name because that's how it, like, the edition I have quotes the book. It's like "Der Kritik der political economy."
That's funny. Sorry to
Anyway,
cut you off. I was just cutting
no,
off.
all good. But the Engels spends the rest of the introduction making a distinction between labor and labor power because it's one of the big concepts that Marx developed throughout his whole life. And it's one of the most important concepts he develops. And it's really relevant to this work. So Engels is like, hey, let's get everybody on the same page and explain the difference between these two very similar sounding concepts. So back in the days of yore, in the days of Adam Smith, we had the mercantilist economists, the people who were like, value in an economy comes from like the trade we do with other nations. Well, then Adam Smith came along with his Wealth of Nations and was like, no, we have these other factors of production, land, labor, and capital, but like labor is really where the value is coming from. Like Adam Smith was one of the early proponents starting to develop what we call today the labor theory of value. But Smith, Ricardo, and a number of other economists, they worked on this theory and they were like, okay, so the value of a commodity, just anything you buy, whether that be your eggs, your laptop, your car, your house, it's based on the amount of labor incorporated in it. That was their like first theory back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this worked really well until they were like, well, what determines the value of labor? And I like Marx's quote, or Engels' quote here. If labor is the measure of all values, we can express the value of labor only in labor. We know absolutely nothing about the value of an hour's labor if all that we know about it is that it is equal to 1 hour's labor. It's a tautology to say 1 hour's labor is worth 1 hour's labor. That hasn't told us anything. And so those those plucky little economists, they came up with a new theory. The value of labor is the cost of production of the laborer. So your wages and thus the value of your labor are what it takes for you as a laborer to show up the next day and work again. You buy food, you pay rent, you buy gas, you pay for healthcare, you do all of these things. And all of these things you purchase enable you to show up to work the next day and the next day and support kids that are be able to replace you as a laborer. And so that theory also has problems and contradictions in it because then it begs the question, where does profit come from? If we're assuming, like these economists, Smith and Ricardo, are assuming that things are on average sold at their value, and that value is based on the amount of labor in the thing, then the price of a commodity, anything we buy, should be the cost of the raw materials, which is the value of the past labor embodied in those raw materials. So if I'm at Starbucks and I'm your barista making you a coffee, that's the value of the labor embodied in the coffee beans, the labor embodied in the espresso machine, the labor embodied in the milk. So that's your cost of raw materials. And then your wages, the value of the labor you just did. And so where's the profit? We know that profit does exist. Like, we see companies making profits every day. The owner of any business you've ever worked at does, in fact, get paid. So how can it be that our labor is worth one amount to us, the wages we receive, and that our labor has a different value to our bosses, which is somehow our wages plus their profits? And so we're forced to one of two conclusions. Either labor has two values, one of which is twice the other, or 12 equals 6. In both cases, we get pure absurdities, to quote Engels again. And so, to undo this mess, Marx came up with a new concept, and he proposed that we're not selling our labor, rather we're selling our labor power, or in other words, command over our ability to do work. And now I don't speak German, I can't read German, so I don't actually know if this is true. This next little bit is me talking out of my ass. But when I was reading this to make this PowerPoint, it was interesting, like, labor power. It almost is like power over labor. So I'm not sure if that's what Marx was implying when he made this new term, but I think it's interesting that, like, those words are so close together. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that.
Like the words as in like the power over labor as in
Like, if a more direct translation, or if a more meaningful translation of Arbeitskraft, labor power, is like power over labor. I don't know.
well, labor I think is different from labor power because labor power describes the ability to do labor, whereas labor is more just the labor the work people do in order to get a certain thing done. But the labor power is different from because it describes a worker's ability to be able they sell their ableness to do said work.
Yeah, and my point is that in selling that ableness to do said work, they are selling power over their labor, command over their labor.
Oh,
They're
so
selling to your boss a power to direct your labor.
Like, go off of that. I kind of like your theory, John, of that's what he intended, but I'm not sure. Some expert probably has
You
done
need to
some
find
more
somebody, A, who speaks German, and B, who is a scholar of Marx.
Yeah.
Anywho, we sell our labor power at an agreed upon rate. Like, and our labor power is like what Petamillo is saying. Like, our labor power is
the ableness
for
to
a
do
set
work.
Is when we sell our labor power, we sell our ability to labor for a set period of time for a set value. So if I have a job where I work for $15 an hour, that means I have agreed to let my boss in this job boss me around in exchange for $15 for every hour I let him boss me around, which you hope is enough to live on. In other words, make more labor power for you to sell tomorrow. Like, it wouldn't do your boss any good if he paid you $2 and you couldn't even buy enough food with that to show up to work tomorrow because you were literally starving to death. The system doesn't work. He has to pay you enough that you can show up tomorrow with your body in good physical condition to load the truck or put a smile on your face and serve coffee to your customer at Starbucks or whatever job you do. But while we work, our labor produces some amount of value. We are laboring, and with the combination of mind and body with which we work on those raw materials, we produce some value, say $30 an hour. And so the capitalist gives us back $15 like they agreed in wages and pockets the rest. So thus the value of our labor power was $15, but the value our labor created was $30. This is just putting random numbers on it.
Yeah,
Every situation is different.
extract the surplus value
Yes.
because you uh in terms of value, the worker, um they they um they create more than they like a lot more than they receive back. And then I think that's called the surplus labor is the labor that it takes to create the surplus value.
Exactly. The surplus labor is the labor above and beyond you work for a certain period of time in any given day and you produce the amount of value contained in your wages. But any hours you spend working after that, you are creating value that you don't receive back in wages. You're creating a surplus of value.
Yes.
And that's like exactly what you're saying. And that surplus value is that surplus labor. And that's what's being pocketed by your boss. And so, but what this boils down to in a macroeconomic sense is that when we go to work, we make more stuff than we require to maintain whatever standard of living you individually currently have. Like, as a society, like for society, you have produced more than you have withdrawn back from society. And so, like, it's very interesting because it begs the question, well, if I am making more than I'm using, where's the rest of it going? And I really like Engels' quote here, and then I've got a lovely figure that illustrates how true it holds today, but in America at least. But hence the working class gets back only a part of the entire mass of products produced by it. Like everything we have in today's world is produced by working people working. And as we have just seen, the other portion which the capitalist class retains and which it has to share at most with the landlord class is increasing with every new discovery and invention. Nowadays, I can't help but think of like ChatGPT and what that's going to do for this whole situation. While the share which falls to the working class per capita rises but little and very slowly or not at all, and under certain conditions it may even fall. And this graph on the right here shows that in the United States, the real GDP per capita since 1980 has increased 80%, and yet the median wage of a full-time worker has increased like 3% and has oscillated and risen and fallen throughout that period of time. And I think that to me just says it's Marx's and Engels' arguments throughout the rest of this work make sense, but the fact that we have this chart here is quantitative statistical evidence that, like, yes, the thing they are saying is true, is real life for us.
So the quote means like the quote on the meaning of the quote. Are you there?
Could you repeat that?
Could you explain like the meaning of the quote?
Okay. So I'm going to kind of chunk the quote up and explain each part because it is kind of a long quote. So, hence the working class gets back only a part of the entire mass of products produced by it. And what he's saying there is, like I mentioned, everything we have in this society that is the product of human labor has been created by the working class. Like, by people who go to their jobs and get paid a wage and do work at that job. But you don't receive back all of that value created by that labor. There is another class, or two classes if you want to distinguish between industrial capitalists and landlords, but there are groups of people that consume products of human labor and yet do not contribute labor in the amount that they consume. And so their excess consumption, on the flip side, means that the working class gets back less than they produce. And as we've just seen, the other portion, which the capitalist class retains and only has to share with landlords, is increasing with every new discovery and invention. So, think about robots used in automobile factories that allow automobile production to happen more efficiently and more cheaply. That makes it so that cars can be produced more cheaply, and thus it takes less of our collective human labor to support you as a worker that needs a car if cars are cheaper. The real material, like the cost of living in terms of human labor, has gone down if we leave the standard of living steady. But that new value that's created doesn't just disappear into the ether. It goes into the hands of the capitalist class. And so those new robots being employed in a car factory, or in Marx's time, the new automatic weaving machines that would enable one man to produce 100 times as much yarn, those inventions made it cheaper to sustain the life of a working person. But the capitalist class didn't have much reason to give those working people 100 times as much value, even though they were producing that much. They just had to give them enough that they could continue to survive, and maybe a little more if they were feeling generous. And so the share that falls to the working class rises but a little, and very slowly, or not at all, and sometimes may even fall. And an example of it falling is this recent bout of inflation. I know economists on the headlines like to talk, oh, it's a wage price spiral, wages are increasing, so inflation's increasing. We look at the numbers, inflation has outstripped wage growth by I think at this point, close to 10%. The share that is falling to the working class has fallen in the last 3 years.
Hasn't there been like productivity has gone up tremendously since the 1970s, but wage growth has been this stagnant ever since then?
Oh yeah, this we could get into a more complicated discussion about the organic composition of capital versus the technical composition of capital. But this real GDP per capita represents more of a dollars and hours of labor measure, whereas the actual physical mass of products we produce has, instead of doubling like we see in this chart, it has gone way, way, way beyond that.
So
our actual material productivity.
So essentially the meaning of the quote is that the capitalist class consumes a ton way, way more per one capitalist than per one worker. They consume, or they get way more of the value that is created.
Exactly, and that amount of that share of value tends to increase over time. Now, one important thing to note with that is that capitalist doesn't take all of that value and go spend it on a private jet or a yacht. Some of it they reinvest back into their business. That business is still a business they own, that now with those new investments could make them even more money. So it's not pure wasteful consumption, but nonetheless, that share of value is going to the capitalists which they privately can decide how to use, even though that value is produced by many hundreds or thousands of people. So unless we have any more questions, I'm going to move on to the next slide so we can get into the meat of the book.
I'm ready.
All right. So I got one quick slide on the preliminary. Marx basically uses this to inform the reader of the broader historical context in which he's writing, because we're reading this 170 years after he wrote it in a different time and space. And Marx knows that he's writing about general laws and phenomena that exist in a capitalist economy, but he also wants to make the reader aware, yes, I'm writing about these general things, but here's the specific reason that I'm writing about them right now. And that lets us as readers 170 years later kind of sort between what parts of this is Marx saying yes, this is a this is a phenomena that occurs in capitalism and will almost always occur in capitalism, versus this is Marx trying to make a point because that has something to do with the fact that there were people rioting in the streets in Paris a year ago. Because he was writing in the wake of the Revolution of 1848, which was an uprising in France centered around Paris that caused numerous smaller offshoot uprisings throughout industrializing Europe. I believe in this uprising, I believe there was a lot of tumult. No actual system of organization was ever developed. I believe there were parts of the city that were controlled by the working class for up to 2 months, but I don't recall my history the best. But he observes that these revolutions reveal a conflict and a tension between classes in his present society. Like, and then he argues that this conflict between workers and the capitalist class, he argues that it's not just people rioting in the streets for no reason. Even if the worker on the street couldn't tell you why exactly he's rioting, there is a real material and economic reason behind his going out in the streets and burning shit. And I think it's really interesting to put this in the modern context because we still.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's people in France right now who are rioting.
Exactly. It's like, as the more things change, the more things change the same. There are people in the streets of Paris marching, sometimes setting shit on fire, though they're mostly peaceful, and waving around effigies of the French Prime Minister saying, "We will kill you. Fucking don't raise our retirement age."
I think they're yeah, and then like the pensions, they like changed the pensions. They lowered.
Yes, what they wanted to do is lower the retirement age in France.
Yeah.
Or raise the retirement age in France by 2 years.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of economic analysis we could do of this because France is like a waning economy in a sense, and there is less to go around. But when Macron is having the government raise this pension age, subverting a lot of the democratic procedures that exist in the French Constitution, he is trying to make sure that that decrease in French prosperity doesn't fall on the capitalist class and that it falls on the working class. But I think also, like, we can look at riots, and I mean, I'm using the word riot very generally. We can look at mass scale movements and uprisings and protests in America, like the George Floyd protests can't help but come to mind, as it was the largest mass mobilization in American history. And it's like all of these various, it seems like we've got a simmering, bubbling cauldron of this conflict and tension. And Marx is arguing 170 years ago that that conflict and tension is coming from a material and economic basis. And so, like, as we read this book, I think it's really important to see, okay, do these economic principles he's laying out, can they start to explain whatever conflict and tensions and uprising we see today? That's not to say that these economic things are the only things causing them, but I believe that most of the shit going down that we see has an economic basis. Trump voters don't get up in arms about Mexican immigrants coming and taking their jobs. If they wouldn't be getting up in arms about that if there wasn't a decline in prosperity for the American working class, for instance. Like,
so essentially, there's unrest because like people's material conditions are getting worse.
Yeah. And getting worse or have been bad. I mean, in the case of a lot of these people who are protesting in the summer of 2020, it's like, hey, police have been fucking up our communities, and like the system has been keeping our community impoverished, and police have been the physical aspect of that, keeping us impoverished. We aren't about that. We don't want that. And so, like, it isn't always just about class. There's a term in, like, some liberals use this. It's more on the left. Like, a lot of people on the broader left use this term, but intersectionality between, like, class and race and gender. It's like, okay, you can analyze this thing through the lens of class. You can analyze this thing through the lens of race. You could analyze this thing we observe through the lens of gender. But what you'll find most liberals do today, they're more than happy to talk about race, more than happy to talk about gender, more than happy to talk about all sorts of impression. Even the braver ones are more than happy to talk about like U.S. imperialist impression. But so many of them are scared to talk about class because it leads you to some interesting conclusions. So I guess this slide's a little pointless because we're all familiar with this text. So I'll just skip it. But what are wages? How are they determined? Wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work.
Wait, last slide, did we skip the last one, the questions, or?
I just skipped this because everybody has read this topic before and
could we just see the questions?
Oh yeah, this is the question. It's not really a question. The
Oh.
question is, what are wages? How are they determined?
Oh, well, okay, well then I'll try and answer that. I mean, a wage is the amount that is given for the given time of work that you do, or like the money that you get for working a specific job. So how is it that you would okay, how are they determined? Well, how they are determined, I mean, I think that depends on like legally, like the minimum of how much it is that you are to be paid, or because I mean, I don't think that a capitalist, like I don't think that someone, it's really just basically how little it is that they can pay you, so you can just come back and do it again, so that they can just take as much as possible. And
so I find it interesting that you bring up the legal minimum wage, because as we're going to read in this book, Marx would not agree with that statement. He would not agree that some arbitrary law of man is what's setting the wages that we receive. His argument and kind of thesis throughout this book is that there are real physical relations between us as humans, what we produce, and each other through how we interact economically, through markets, and through contracts that determine these wages in a material basis, based on, like you were saying, the material cost of allowing me as a worker to show up to work the next day being one of those things. The material cost for, like, me, for instance, I'm studying for a graduate degree in nuclear engineering. There is a real cost to the education I'm receiving. The professors that are teaching me these things I'm learning that enable me to work, they have to eat and survive and maintain their standards of living. And so all of that labor right now that society is pouring into me to create me as a worker, that is part of my cost of production as a worker. And so there's many tangents we could go off on that, but this is an interesting book because it's very natural to say what you said and bring up the minimum wage, because it's an issue that people are agitating around. It's a very real issue for some people who are getting paid that minimum wage. And it seems like it would be an obvious answer to this question. But if that were the case, why isn't everybody making a wage? And that's what Marx is going to answer for us here. So, wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work. By giving him, the laborer, 2 shillings, the capitalist has given them so much meat, so much clothing, so much wood, light, in exchange for their day's work. The 2 shillings, therefore, express the relation in which labor power is exchanged for other commodities, the exchange value of labor power. And so, I don't want to, okay, yeah. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't about to say something that I cover on the next slide. But I think a really interesting thing you can draw from this quote, Marx is coming right out and saying, like, hey, The same way that clothing, wood, and light and meat are commodities, your labor power is a commodity. And as he's going to develop throughout the book, the price of your labor power, your wage, is governed by the same forces that govern the prices of any other commodity in the market. And so this leads into a question. Living 170 years after Marx wrote this and living in the United States inside the imperialist core, where we benefit greatly from unequal exchange, as Danny told us a couple weeks ago, the basic standard of living and the commodities which compose it have expanded quite a bit because the meat, clothing, wood, which is a substitute for like heating, we use natural gas nowadays, and light that Marx mentions. Can y'all list some commodities that are necessary for life in modern society that weren't considered necessary or didn't exist when Marx was writing?
Phones. Like, not. I mean, necessary, but like.
I would argue that phones are pretty darn necessary.
Well, I mean, computers.
Definitely like the internet.
Mm-hmm. Like, if you want to participate in today's society, you need the internet. Not that everybody has the internet, but
in some form, transportation. If that be a bike or a car.
But like transportation existed, like when.
But it's different modern day because of like modern society, suburbs and whatnot. You cannot live in the suburbs without a car.
Yeah.
And that leads kind of into the next question, like, what are some commodities that are not necessarily necessary for survival, but are necessary to have a decent standard of living, like,
or that have been made
contribute to your life having dignity? So that car, you can get by in the suburbs, and I know some people that do, who don't have a car, but their life is really tough. They'd be having to walk an hour each day to work, or bike on incredibly dangerous streets, or wait for a bus that comes once every hour. Like, and so I think it's important to kind of divide into two. Like, I would argue that the phones and internet thing, that pretty much is a necessity in today's world. But then there are also commodities, and I think we should try to name a few more. But like a car, like Nick's mentioning, that while it's not necessary,
it's been made necessary by some certain areas. Some certain areas, it is more necessary than the other thing, which I think that I think we should maybe, like, in maybe a different sort of slideshow, maybe we should talk about like suburban patterns of development or like growth Ponzi schemes.
Oh yeah, I was well into that sort of stuff before I was ever into leftist stuff. So
we should talk about that.
I would love to have us do a presentation about that.
Yeah.
Good idea. But yeah, what are some other things that, like, you can survive without, but your life is almost like beneath the dignity of what we think a human life should be if you don't have it?
Wait, repeat the question?
So, like, what are some other commodities that may not be, like, necessary, like, you can survive day to day without them, but, like, they are necessary to have a decent standard of living and, like, a life that has dignity. I mean, every life has dignity, but I look at a person who's homeless and I'm like, man, society has stripped them of that dignity.
Maybe, what do you think that, things like that, examples?
I mean, so I think of some things like something like having a nice change of clothes. Like, when you may be able to get by day to day with just the clothes you go to work in and, like, clothes that cover your body. But there's something that's added to your dignity and to your, like, satisfaction with your life as a human. That, like, if you have just that one night, like a one nice change of clothes or two nice changes of clothes, that could be an example of this. For some people, I think for, like, a lot of young people nowadays, being able to have enough money to get their daily Starbucks coffee, that's something that, like, it makes life a little worth living and it adds some of that dignity to their life. That Starbucks coffee, no offense, is not necessary for your life. But, like, it's necessary to have your life be worth living.
Um,
So like,
So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
What were you saying, Sam?
I was gonna say like exercise, like gym or
Oh
weights or
yes.
whatever. It's not necessary. It's not. I mean, most people don't really need to work out to live, but it's something that it really has an impact in your uh, standard of living.
And your mental health.
Yeah, mental health in general too. It's something that
Hmm.
I mean, you could
Mm-hmm.
be depressed as shit and still living, but having access to the meds or the therapy or whatever you need to have good mental health really increases your standard of living, but is not strictly necessary. It's not bread and water and heat that you
Mm-hmm.
need to necessarily live.
And like when we look at individuals experiencing homelessness, it's like, what do they consume? If we can answer that first question by answering what do they consume? Well, they consume probably a little bit of food. They have some sort of clothing, hopefully warm clothing. And sometimes on the coldest of nights, cities will open warming centers so they don't freeze to death. But then there's a big gap between that, what's necessary to sustain a life, and that's not even sustaining a worker, that's just sustaining somebody living. And then actually all these things that like you'd like Sam saying, like having the time and the time to exercise and like physical stamina left to exercise, having mental health and access to those resources, like those things are necessary if you want to look at that person and say like that person's really living. I kind of thinking about fulfilling Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you've got your basic needs like food and shelter and safety, but then a life where you just have food and shelter isn't much of a life at all. So, I mean, I think with what we've discussed, yes, I think we would agree that this quote applies today. Like this quote above about the relationship with, by giving us whatever we receive as wages, the capitalist has given us so much meat, so much clothing, so much wood, so much light, so much smartphone, so much car, so much access to therapists, so much ability to exercise in exchange for our day's work. So I don't know if we agree, push back.
Oh no, 100% agree with it is more. I would say more or less the same of equivalence. Sure, we have fancy iPhone, but we still have the same.
I agree, but I also want to add that this current like economic system that we live in, or this like social system that we live in, sometimes it makes you want to have some things that you might like have considered like making like life quote unquote more worth living. So in like the social system that we live under, it creates those wants. It creates an artificial demand that it's not like that it's not like essential, or it doesn't actually maybe make you more full, more of like a better person, but the demand is created to sort of like create like just like another market, to just another sector to just extract profit out of. So
And that
sometimes
is
it's artificial. Sometimes like you know like you don't like and that's not to say that some things like they aren't like something that is like you're bad, like you're a bad person if you like this thing that maybe is like is an artificial demand. But it's just that like you could you know there could maybe be something better than this, because yeah.
I that's a really interesting point you bring up. I believe in Socialism, Scientific, and Utopian, though it could have been another work by Engels. Engels writes something to the effect of A worker living in a shack next to a house is going to look at that house and be like, man, I wish I was living in that house. And yeah, like, it's human nature to look, and like, if your neighbor's house is like quite a bit nicer than yours, it's like, man, I don't know, maybe I want to work to get a nicer house like that. But like, I want that life for myself. But then when that worker looks at a palace, he uses the word palace, but we could today easily use the word like mansion, or like just resort, like upper class resort, like think Mar-a-Lago, Trump's big resort or something like that. It human You have to have something to compare to. Once comparison drives want, and by the existence of things like the mansions at Mar-a-Lago, it causes our human, like, some innate human jealousy in us to go like, hey, I want that.
Well,
Whereas
what
somebody pushing back.
I think what you're describing would be like the alienation of labor that people, like said person who's comparing himself to another person, like the product of other people's labor and all of like the labor that it took to create said palace is alienated and it's covered up. So like the processes behind creating like a huge like Mar-a-Lago like or a mansion or whatever is covered up. So someone might say, "Oh, I want this," but that might just be because they don't understand, because of the alienation of the products of labor, that
Yes.
it will take more to maintain this thing. So if you actually understand that, then you're actually not going to want that thing, because it's going to take way more. So it's sort of like
Trump would not
it's
be living in Mar-a-Lago if Trump had to do the amount of work that is required to live in Mar-a-Lago.
yeah. So it's like luxury is a myth.
Um,
It's like
keep
it's
going.
the labor is alienated, the product of labor and the actual sort of like its image that it creates is covered up by the yeah,
And
it's mystified.
to kind of round this back to what Penamillo was saying, I find it interesting because since Marx's time, the capitalist class has discovered that it has to keep the working class consuming in order for this system to continue to work. And so you were talking about like created desires. And so my point with bringing up Mar-a-Lago was that comparison creates desires, but we've also discovered this other great way to create desires in people, and that's called advertisement.
Huh.
And we don't think of advertisement, we think of it as a fact of life. But what it really is propaganda. Propaganda is just any message being put out to make you believe something, being put out there to you to make you believe something. But it is propaganda making you believe that your life will be X amount better if you buy the new Ford F-150. You'll be a real man. Or like, if you buy our wealth management product, you'll get this great satisfaction in life you've been waiting for. Or if you buy our toothpaste, you'll have that awesome smile and you'll get hella women into you. Just
Huh.
anything like that. Like, that urge to consume is being created in us. And while I'm not arguing against any amount of consumption, we need to be aware. People should be consuming based on what they actually want, not based on what they're being told to want.
Yeah, and like I was saying, like a lot of like artificial desire, and it's maintained on the alienation of labor and the alienation of the products of labor, because people just see a product or a commodity and they don't understand like the process that it took, what it took to create said commodity. So because the market has a mystifying character where it just appears on the marketplace. It creates a mystified image of what that product really represents or what it really is. So if people were to if the alienation were to be unmystified or revealed, people would see like a lot of the capitalist system for what it really is, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. So I think we've talked about this slide to exhaustion, unless anybody else has anything to say.
No, we should probably move on.
Yeah, we probably got to speed it up a little bit too
Yeah.
to be mindful of people's time. But so I guess what jobs do you guys all work, real quick, so we can have some context when we're talking about the rest of this stuff?
I don't have a job.
I'm working research, undergrad research.
I'm a lab
And I'm
technician
working
at
at a
a
grad research, so I'm doing the same thing basically.
What was that, Danny?
lab technician at a winery.
Oh, a lab tech. No, that's an important job. My lab tech is really helpful at my research, my lab.
I'm a software developer.
Aristocracy over here.
yeah.
I don't have a job. Well, a job that like I do things I don't.
Well, I don't have a job next week, so
Oh, really?
Next week.
yeah, my contract is gonna expire
Dang.
Oh
in a
shit.
few days. It's been a whole year since I've been here. That's gonna be the end of my visa.
Oh, and you're gonna head back to Hungary?
On the 3rd of April.
Oh, that's
Oh,
my
wow.
birthday. That's the worst. Danny going back home is the worst birthday present for me.
That is 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
Man.
That's right.
So you had a contract and it expired.
Yeah. So I'm on a J1 visa, and the longest period you can apply for a J1 visa is 1 year.
Yes.
That
Do you
is
have a plan after you get
unfortunate.
back, or are you just gonna figure it out from there?
Well, first of all, I just want to relax and obviously help with the family business, and then I'll see.
Oh, very nice. So I guess, and the reason I bring that up is just like keep in the back of your mind, like trying to relate these topics we discussed to whatever job you do. And if you're struggling to do that, we can discuss it, and I'm sure we can figure pretty easy to bring these things back to the present discussion. So it's pretty natural for us as workers to subconsciously think of ourselves as collaborators with the capitalist in production. They bring the raw materials and tools to the table, we bring our labor, and we split the proceeds from the sale of the goods produced. Like that's kind of, I think, most people's subconscious understanding of how this system works. But Marx disagrees. He tells us, which any businessman will tell you that this is true, the part of his existing wealth of his capital, the capitalist buys the labor power of the weaver in exactly the same manner as, with another part of his wealth, he has bought the raw material, the yarn, and the instrument of labor, the loom. After he's made these purchases, and among them belongs the labor power necessary to the production of the cloth, he produces only with raw materials and instruments of labor belonging to him. And based on our legal system, since he produced with stuff that only belongs to him, he keeps it all. And so, what are you guys' thoughts on this quote? Do you understand it? Do you agree, disagree? Why not? There
My
are
thought is
jobs that
that-
this applies to directly. There are jobs that it doesn't. So, pull on any of those threads.
My thought is that Marx really loves talking about linen.
Yes, sir. But I think one interesting thing is like we look at this applies to a lot of jobs, but one that came to mind when I'm trying to think, okay, where does this not directly apply? Is when you're like an Uber driver. Because I mean, technically, while the money that they pay the person you're giving a ride to travels through Visa system, travels through the banking system, blah blah blah. It's not the same piece of money. You're kind of, since it's a service. It's not an Uber ride isn't a commodity production. It's a service production, and since that service is delivered the moment it's produced, that thing, that ride, you kind of can see yourself taking a split and a chunk of that ride which you produced. And so it is interesting that it doesn't change the underlying dynamic and relationship between the worker and the capitalist too much, but it is different.
Mm-hmm.
Like it almost something like Uber lends a petty bourgeois characteristic to that production. Like people can feel like, oh, I'm working for myself. I'm running my own business. It's actually not petty bourgeois. It almost reminds me more of the arrangement a serf has, where they paid a land rent. Like they would grow some wheat and pay some of that wheat back to the person whose land they were on, the lord of the manor.
That
And kind
feudalism.
of the same way,
Feudalism.
yes, the feudal arrangement. That's kind of what the Uber driver's engaging in. It's like the same way that serf had their own little plot of land and their own little shack built on it, and their own plow and stuff. The Uber driver has their own car, and they're using their own labor time, their own time laboring, and they're producing a certain amount of money, but they have to pay a pretty decent chunk of that money directly back to Uber, because Uber's like, oh, but the same way the lord of the man is like, oh, I've provided you with this field. Uber is like, oh, but I've provided you with this market. I've provided you with this app. I've connected you to the customer. So, hey up, buddy.
The gig economy is a product of the financialization of the economy. The gig economy.
Mm-hmm. And so for time's sake, I'm going to move on again. So, this is a long quote, but I think it just hits so hard that it's worth reading here and seeing if anybody has any reaction. I'm going to take a sip of water. So consequently, labor power is a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to the capitalist. Why do we sell it? It is in order to live. He does not count the labor as part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity that he has auctioned off to another. The product of his activity, therefore, is not the aim of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, or the gold that he draws up the mining shaft, not the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages, and the silk, the gold, and the palace are resolved for him into a certain quantity of the necessaries of life, perhaps into a cotton jacket, into copper coins, and into a basement dwelling. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours' work, on the other hand, has no meaning for him as weaving, spinning, boring, so on, but only as earnings, which enable him to sit down at table, take his seat in tavern, and to lie down in bed. So some of us are privileged. One of my thoughts going right off this was that like some of us are privileged enough to have found jobs that provide meaning to our lives. Like Marx is saying, labor has no meaning. It is just zero meaning can be extracted from the labor. And he's talking about like labor in its most base form. Like when I was working at UPS, I didn't derive too much meaning from picking up boxes and putting them in the back of trucks. But some of us are privileged to have jobs that provide some level of meaning to our lives in addition to sustenance. Like I know my dad really enjoys his engineering work and it really gives him satisfaction in his life. So, what are our thoughts? Are we equally likely to land in a job that is conducive to finding this meaning depending on your gender, race, or class?
Well, my thoughts on the quote is that, I mean, essentially, labor having or labor, as Marx describes in the quote, like this person not wanting to work because of the thing that he does or the thing that he actively like produces is, I think, a product of the commodification of labor power,
Exactly.
because labor power is a commodity, so you're just selling it to get a wage.
And like to abstract from what you're saying, we are selling some of our time. Live. It's like every band has 24 hours in a day, and you're like, all right, this part of my life belongs to you so that I can have some money with which to buy the things I need to live.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I think it is. I think that like the on the finding meaning, I think it is part of like the labor aristocracy or what you might call the professional managerial class because there definitely are people that do find meaning in their lives and like that is awesome. This is not to detract from that. Like a doctor who is truly thriving in their role as a doctor and is like I love going to work every day because I'm getting to like really make an impact in people's lives. That is awesome. But it is really hard when you're showing up every day to like a McDonald's and working the grill in the back. It is just because of the I think part of it comes from the fact that you're getting paid less, but it is hard to sit there at the back of that grill. You have customers coming and yelling at you and whining at you and treating you like shit. It's really hard to say, man, my life has so much meaning because I just made all this food for all these. It's a much more demeaning environment, a demeaning job to be working, which really makes it harder to find that satisfaction and meaning and leads you to a point where your 12 hours work have no meaning, only as earnings, which enable you to do the other things with me.
Yeah, like someone's sort of like ability to actually be like fulfilled at their job would, I think, depends on like the material conditions of said the material conditions. I think it depends on that.
Certainly. So then at the end of this section, Marx compares the relations of slave and master, serf and lord, and wage laborer and capitalist, and he observes that the laborer belongs neither to an owner nor to the soil, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his daily life belong to whomsoever buys them. So why do we think Marx is bringing this up? What's the point here?
Repeat the question.
So when Marx, because in reading the text, we covered the part where he's talking about the relations, how a slave is sold, like how a slave is sold once and for all of that, none of that slave's labor power belongs to that slave. He's been sold for life and is traded as commodity. The serf, the serf like gives up a portion of his proceeds, but he is tied to the land and has that land. But the wage laborer is auctioning themselves off for some amount of hours every day. So why is Marx bringing up this distinction, this difference between these different modes of production?
I think
Why do you, from reading what we read, why do you guys think?
I think it's to sort of like bring up a historical materialist perspective of to bring up a historical materialist perspective and to use that to show how the class relations have evolved over time.
I think that's part of it. Anybody else want to go before I show the next slide with basically the answer? All right, I'll flip to it. So, then he has a quote a little lower down in that paragraph. But the worker whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power cannot leave the whole class of buyers, that is the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class. It is for him to find his man, that is, to find a buyer in this capitalist class. And so when I read this, I think the point Marx is trying to make here is that so often we hear, oh no, but you're free in this system. If you don't like your boss, you're free to quit. Go find a new, better boss. And like, those bad bosses, they just won't have any workers because they're bad bosses. And the whole thing will work out and everybody's life will be so great. And Marx's point is that there is still an element of coercion the same way these elements of coercion existed in past systems. In the instance of the slave has been sold for their whole life and is the property of that master. That master controls whether that slave eats or not. And the master would like to keep feeding and housing their slave because they want their slave to keep doing work for him. But if that slave starts to disobey and says, no, I want more, I want better clothes, I want more food, the master can just say, oh, well, fuck you, you don't get that. See, like, you're trapped in that arrangement. The serf has to pay a certain quantity of their proceeds, and if they were to stop giving their land rent, the lord of the manor can send their knights and kick that serf right off of his land. We as wage laborers, though, it is a distinctly materially different relationship. We don't have land we're tied to, and we haven't sold our labor power for our whole lives. We sell our labor power a bit at a time, maybe daily, weekly. In the case of a salary, you could argue yearly, though that's a whole mess, worms to open up. But we every day have to find somebody to sell those hours of our life to. And if we stop doing that, the same way the slave or the serf can be cut off from their means of subsistence and the means of production which enable them to work, we can be cut off from that just as easily. But other than the master, who had to be somewhat responsible and ensure that he was providing some level of sustenance for his slave, or the lord that had to provide some level of protection to the serf from bandits and whatnot, any individual capitalist can be entirely irresponsible to their workers. And like, oh, if I don't exist anymore as a capitalist, there's another capitalist just down the street. Like, the increase in mobility that we have in this present society means that there is less of an obligation for any individual capitalist to uphold that social contract between exploited class and exploiter class. And so I think that's kind of why he's bringing that up.
And I also just want to mention that peasants or serfs becoming wage laborers, there was a lot of coercion going into that.
Oh, yeah.
They were kicked off their land and they were forced to move into cities and
Primitive accumulation.
and pay rent and buy food instead of producing it for themselves. Like the very beginning of capitalism was just mainly a wealth transfer from feudal to capitalist relations.
So this brings us to the next section. So like, we've established that labor power is a commodity. Well, then if we're going to ask how wages are determined, we need to know how the price of a commodity is determined. And so Marx gives us a short answer at the beginning of the chapter. He's going to spend the rest of the chapter going into explaining this sentence, but he says, by the competition between buyers and sellers, by the relation of the demand to the supply, of the call to the offer, or the competition by which the price of a commodity is determined is threefold. So then Marx uses this metaphor of armies. He says industry leads two great armies into the field against each other, and each of these again is engaged in a battle among its own troops and in its own ranks. The army among whose troops there is less fighting carries off the victory over the opposing host. And when he says an army, he's talking about the army of sellers or the army of buyers. All the people with a commodity that want to sell it for a price. The sellers want to sell it for the highest price. The buyers want to buy it for the lowest price. But when there's a lot of sellers, that means there's going to be a lot of competition to get that sale made. And so sellers are going to be tempted to undercut each other, offer a lower price to the buyers. The buyers can just chill and relax and say, all right, sellers, come to me with a really low price because I know you guys are desperate to sell, so one of you is going to have to go along with it. The flip side is true if there's infighting in the army of buyers. We've seen with suppliers of like oil in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you see there's suddenly far less supply than there is demand, and so all of the buyers suddenly are competing and driving up the price and saying, no, I'm willing to pay this much for the oil, I'm willing to pay this much for the oil. And so the sellers then can sit contentedly and wait until some buyer comes along to them and offers an outrageous amount of money. So Marx is talking in this section about a competitive market. He's not arguing that all markets are competitive, but that's what he's starting with. He's taking the capitalists at their best word, like saying, okay, suppose we do have this competitive market that you guys say exists. So where do you guys think that these competitive markets do exist today, and where don't they exist? Because, well, yeah, what markets do you think are competitive, and what do you think are not?
I mean, Marx is not saying that this applies to competitive markets only, because there's an army among whose troops there is less fighting, which might as well apply to imperialists like Walmart, who dominate the labor market of some towns.
You are making the exact point I was hoping somebody would make. So exactly, like today, like Danny's saying with Walmart, we have some uncompetitive markets where if there's a monopoly or an oligopoly in an industry, that means there are very, very few troops in that army with which to like have infighting. And so he's then asking like, what is a rise and what is a fall of prices? Because we can observe prices rising and falling. What is a high and what is a low price? And I love his symbolic language. A grain of sand is high when examined through a microscope, and a tower low compared with a mountain. If the price is determined by the relationship of supply and demand, by what is this relation determined? It's not just some... Marx's point here is like, supply and demand. We learn them in Econ 101. We see those two lines that they cross on a graph. That's all well and good, but those lines don't just come out of the ether. They don't just exist because they exist. He's saying they have a real material basis. So then he like describes asking a capitalist, like, okay, like, where do your profits come from? Or blah, 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 blah. And he has a little paragraph where he does that. And to sum it up, what is it then that serves this citizen capitalist as the standard of his profit? The cost of production of his commodities. So Marx is arguing like that supply curve we talk about, that is set at the end of the day. And I mean, most economists would agree, like by the cost of production of those commodities. But then distortions come into play due to lack of competitiveness or competitiveness in the market. And so like Imagine in a competitive market, we see the price of something rise due to a supply or demand shock. Sellers will raise the prices as high as they can to maximize profit. But in the long term, investors will invest in that industry because they're like, holy shit, they're making 20% profits on their capital over there. I want some of those profits. So they pour more and more capital into that industry, produce more and more, bring in more marginal sources of production, raising the price of production and increasing the competition in the army of sellers. And eventually this reaches a new this system reaches a new equilibrium, which Marx calls in later parts of his works, like the tendency of the rate of profit to equalize, or yeah. But so how does this hypothetical competitive market compare to what we see in different markets today?
Repeat. How does
this hypothetical competitive market, where somebody can, if they see a lot of profits being made in one area, some investor can come in and just go, all right, I'm investing. I'm gonna try to get my piece of the pie. How does that situation compare with a lot of the markets we see today?
Well, the thing about like quote unquote competitive markets is that like the competitive aspect of when it is that people like describe markets as being competitive, like a lot of the times it's not true, and it's like a myth about capitalism, because a lot of companies like lobby to actively like make like they don't want competition. Like the biggest companies within a market, they don't want competition. And the thing about like competition is that there's winners, and that when it is that someone wins, there's like when a company wins the market, that means like that. I mean, capitalism leads like at first, like in an early like capitalist mode of production, maybe there's competitive markets where you have different like companies competing with like prices and like trying to get the most people to buy their things and to you know win the market. But the thing is that once a company wins, they want to reach a stage where there is no competition. That's the thing. That's why it is that in capitalism, like just describing capitalism as having a competitive aspect, that's wrong, because like companies themselves don't want to compete with other like companies. And then the thing is that I think in the oil companies, they have like an oligopoly where they actively like they will help each other to just maintain their position, because they're monopolies, and they in like they're them each other helping each other, they maintain their monopolistic position. And I think it's a similar thing with other markets within this country, where like stores or whatever, they'll like the biggest like companies within a certain branch of the economy, they don't want competition. They don't want competition outside of. They don't want any competition.
And so I guess this leads to a question. So like, let's take the automobile industry for instance. That industry has been having record profits in the last few years. They've noticed that there's a ton of demand for cars, and that they can get away with selling fewer cars for higher prices, far exceeding, even though there is an increased cost of production, far exceeding that increased cost of production. So what's stopping somebody from going in and starting their own car company to get some of those profits?
Oh, but what's stopping them is the falling rate of profit, because because everything, it costs way too much to actually, like, maintain a company. And like, if you wanted to start a car, like a car company, you're gonna have to, like, quote unquote, compete with the largest companies. And I mean, they have like huge, like, they can survive the rising prices that it takes to be able to maintain what it is, like, their operations. But like, if you want to start like a company, the prices and the amount that it's going to take to be able to start that, and also like the big companies themselves, them, it's going to be extremely difficult. And it would depend on the state of said market, and it would depend on a lot of different things. But in general, like, if said country is in a stage where it is that monopolies just have just complete control over the market, it is very unlikely that you're going to be able to maintain that.
So would you agree that it kind of boils down to startup costs and trade secrets? In our automobile industry example?
Yeah, because, and that's another thing, like, trade secrets. I mean, yeah.
All right, I just want to see. Okay, good. 2 slides left. I don't want to keep you guys too long. I apologize.
No, I
So,
like this.
and I thought this was really interesting because Marx mentions, after this explanation about supply, he says, we could show from another point of view how not only the supply, but the demand is determined by the cost of production, but this would lead us too far away from the cost of from our subject. And I think, writing for his day, Marx was right to maintain his focus on his subject, because back in Marx's day, bourgeois economists, they didn't even have an explanation left for where value comes from. They were like, they had all those contradictions that he pointed out and that he cut through with his labor theory of value, but it took them quite a bit of time before they came up with a new theory. But now they do have mainstream economists do have a theory, and I believe that theory reflects a half truth, that they've discovered half of what Marx discovered. And because there is an element of truth to what they talk about, I think that it's worth discussing. So if you ask any sort of Chicago school economist, Keynesian economist, Austrian economist, like, all right, where does the value come from? They would talk about the subjective theory of value, which claims that the value of a commodity comes from how much a consumer is willing to pay for it, and thus how much utility that commodity has to them as a consumer. And so one of the big problems that they say this solved was, let's say you're thirsting to death in the desert, and somebody has a bottle of water and somebody's got a diamond. Which are you going to pay more money for? Like, it's going to be the bottle of water. You're thirsting to death. And so they're like, see, the value of that bottle of water to that person right there, that depended on the utility. It didn't depend on how much labor went into it. It was just dependent on how much that person wanted that. And that's all well and good to talk about in a purely abstract hypothetical situation of a desert and one person in the market. But that analogy entirely breaks down if you start to consider, like, how an actual economy would function in that sense. Like, if there were a number of people in a desert that needed water, some entrepreneurial young chap could come along and say, hey, let's start a water supplying company, and for a relatively small amount of money, they could deliver water to that point in the desert. But if they would not be able to deliver hundreds of thousands of diamonds to that point in the desert, because it takes significantly more labor to extract and polish those diamonds than it does to make a bottle of water and drive it out on a truck to the middle of the desert. And so their subjective theory of value is grounded in an abstraction that can't exist, kind of. And people today like to deny this, but Marx actually acknowledged that subjective utility in his theories. But these people haven't read Marx typically. But Marx talks about exchange value, the amount of value expressed in human labor hours or in dollars of a product, and use value, which is utility to you. The utility to you, basically. And one of the things he says is really important is like, for something to have exchange value, for me to work for an hour and for there to be an hour of labor embodied in that work, I have to be creating something that is useful to society. If I went out in John, if I go out into my backyard and spend an hour with a shovel digging a hole, nobody is going to buy my hole from me for the value of an hour of my labor because nobody wants that. And so the argument of exchange value and labor embodied hinges on that labor done being useful labor. And so to that end, I would argue that like translating Marx's theory of this into modern terms is that the exchange value, the cost of production in terms of human labor, sets the supply curve. Because even though you see supply and demand as straight lines on a graph, once you really dig into economics, they tell you, oh yeah, that straight line's an oversimplification. There's actually a really complicated curve of like how many suppliers would be willing to supply how much of a good at a certain price. And so you get like a jagged, weird looking curve on that graph. And then use value, that utility to you as a consumer, sets the demand curve. You're gonna find more use. You're gonna be willing to exchange a tenth of an hour of your labor for a Starbucks coffee. You're probably not willing to exchange 4 hours of your labor for a Starbucks coffee, if that makes sense. And so that utility in relation to the utility of other objects which you can acquire with your labor sets the demand curve. So there's some D Economics 101.
Yes.
If nobody has anything to say on that, then I just got one more quote for us to chew on. So this week we've thus seen that the price of a commodity is indeed determined by its cost of production, but in such a manner that the periods in which the price of these commodities rises above the cost of production are balanced by the periods in which it sinks below, and vice versa. Of course, this does not hold good for any single given product of an industry, but only for that branch of industry. So also does it not hold good for an individual manufacturer, but only for the whole class of manufacturers. A lot of people like to dunk on Marx and say, you could never run a business with like the way Marxian economics works. And it's like, no shit. He's not talking about with statements like this, he's not talking about your microeconomics as a business. He's talking about the system in an industry functioning as a whole, and your business is one quantum of that industry. And so I just like to bring that up because it's one of the things you hear so often, like, Marx was wrong because of X. And it's like, oh, not only is that not what Marx said, Marx explicitly came out and said, guys, that's not what I'm saying. So thank you for your time and putting up with my lecture on our chapter of Wage, Labor, and Capital. We will have a list of how much of the book we're going to read for next week up soon, hopefully.
I liked it. I liked the slideshow. I liked your presentation.
Thanks for all your work, John. That was really good.
Thank you. It was really good.
I appreciate it, guys. Hopefully we can get some more people to show up next week.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit.
And I'm
No,
sorry.
Even though we've all probably read it, it's still good to have it recorded and thrown on for future reference. And we might come back to it again and have another rereading, years down. But
Very true.
Sorry I wasn't here last week.
oh no, you're fine. You're doing some on the ground work.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll
Anyway,
head off. See you guys next week.
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye.
you.